Okay, so it's been a while. Again. The last regular episode of Mellow Gaming Recommends, which focused on Advance Wars, was way back in April of last year, and I said at the end of that video that in 2022 we were going to get a little self-indulgent with the game picks in this series. Obviously I haven't done a great job of doing that, and so why don't we just pretend I said the next few episodes will be self-indulgent and move on. By self-indulgent, I mean the games I've always wanted to cover on this series, regardless of how often they were covered by other gaming channels on YouTube. I've always wanted to have a mixture of well-known games and the more obscure stuff that I connected with. The indie and the cult retro stuff, that sort of thing. When it comes to the well-known games I've always wanted to cover on here, I don't think there's anything bigger than today's subject. This is a game I've played so much over the years, in its various releases, that I dread to think how many hours I've sunk into it in total. I'm pretty sure I'll be playing through it again in the near future too. It's a game that changed the direction of a whole series, that dared to be 2D in a time of 3D dominance, that is today considered a classic, and often appears on greatest games of all time lists. A game so influential it helped spawn an entire genre, with a lot of help from Metroid. But that's enough hyping it up. We should actually get on with this because I have kept you waiting long enough as it is. It's time for Mellow Gaming Recommends Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. Stories of vampires and the heroes that slay them is one of the tropes that will likely never die. Ever since Bram Stoker penned his novel Dracula in 1897, the stories have piled up across many mediums. It only took 25 years for vampires to become ubiquitous enough an idea for the silent cinema of the 1920s to start putting their own spin on these creatures of the night. It was F.W. Murnau's German expressionist film Nosferatu that first brought the vampires off the page and onto the screen. Nosferatu itself wasn't an official adaptation of Stoker's novel. The filmmakers were even sued by Stoker's heirs and led to a court ruling that all copies must be destroyed. Yes, they were copyright striking fan projects 100 years ago too. Thankfully, all copies of the film were not actually destroyed. Despite being an unofficial adaptation of Dracula, the film's influence is as strong with cinema as Bram Stoker's Dracula is to literature. Although obviously we'd likely never have Nosferatu without Dracula, it's hard to say we'd never have had Dracula in cinematic form if Nosferatu had never been made. The first official Dracula film was released in 1931, directed by Todd Browning and starring the legendary Bela Lugosi. They based this on the Hamilton Dean play from 1924. From there on, Dracula and vampires became a cultural touchstone that has never really been out of fashion, not even when they sparkled. The original Castlevania game, released on the Famicom in 1986 under the name Akumajo Dracula, showed heavy influence from the previously mentioned movies. The series revolves around the appearance of a mysterious demon castle within which resides the evil Dracula. Once every 100 years, or sooner if the plot requires it, Dracula's castle appears in Transylvania, and it is often down to members of the Belmont clan to put a stop to his evil plans, armed with an enchanted whip and a host of other weapons. Most of the games follow this setup in some way. Castle appears, someone enters to fight the monster and such, Dracula is defeated, and the castle collapses, because Dracula is a load-bearing boss. There's a few exceptions, often involving areas surrounding the castle. Sometimes the castle isn't even the main area, but generally you end up facing the Prince of Darkness in a duel to the death, and put him away until the next time he decides to wake up and be a pain in everyone's neck. Literally. The horror influences of the series don't just stop with Dracula and his many films. Over the course of the majority of the games, you'll encounter many classic Universal movie-influenced monsters, such as a Medusa, the Mummy, and even a Frankenstein's monster. You'll see zombies and wolfmen and all sorts, and then you'll whip them in the face until they're all dead. Even though each game tells its own story, there's always a familiarity to the structure of each game. When it comes to this structure, you'll often hear people refer to the series having two distinct main eras, separated by the release of today's subject. Generally, people see the pre-Symphony of the Night games as being linear, level-by-level based platforming action games, as opposed to the less linear Metroid-influenced exploration-based platform RPGs that the series leaned into post-1997. For the most part, this does hold true, but I do feel this pretty much ignores that the series was leaning towards a more open and exploration-centered experience from as early as the second entry in the series. Castlevania 2 is a game that, for many years, had a bit of an unnecessarily bad rap on these interwebs, possibly thanks to early YouTube angry reviewers telling people about how obtuse and difficult and bad the game was. They were exaggerating a fair bit. Don't get me wrong, the game has flaws, but for the time it's a pretty danged inventive game. Not to mention how it expands on the first game's format by allowing for more exploration and encouraging you to try out all sorts of approaches to solving this mystery. I'd agree that the game is maybe not so fluid to play through these days. It hasn't aged as well as other exploration based games of the era, but Castlevania 2 does deserve to be seen in a better light than it had been for a long time. The experimentation didn't end there though. Castlevania 3 allows you to switch between multiple characters, including the son of Dracula, Alucard, making his first appearance prior to starring in Symphony of the Night. You'll also get occasional branching paths between stages, allowing you to choose your own path through the game. Branching paths returned in Dracula X Rondo of Blood, a game that's generally considered the best classic style Castlevania game. Many do consider it the best entry overall. I would too, because it's great, but I am also very bad at it. The point I'm making here is that the series was trending towards a non-linear approach for a number of years. This was actually fairly unique for a platforming series at the time too, because generally similar games were either sticking to a regular level by level progression, or at most, having an overworld map. There wasn't much beyond Metroid that was giving you large exploration based platforming back then, which is why what Castlevania was doing was interesting, and what it would do next helped define an entire genre. Whilst development of this game started with Toru Hagihara on the Sega 32X, upon his promotion the reins were passed to Koji Igarashi, who went on to infuse the game with the style and feel the Castlevania series is so well known for today. Right, this has been a fair bit of preamble before we get onto the main event, although less than I had originally planned. I've rewritten this a number of times to find the approach I'm happiest with. Usually my Mellow Gaming Recommends episodes are very feature and mechanics focused. I tend to go over the functions of the games I cover and the way the gameplay itself works, but I feel like this is the wrong approach for this game. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a game that, to me, feels more like an experience, a location, than a collection of technical processes and structured forms. When I play this, I don't really think about how item choices or stats affect the experience, although there's quite some depth to be gathered there. Over the years, my many playthroughs of this game have led to me being more interested in the experience of exploring the castle and defeating the evil within. I usually start playing with one or two goals in mind. Either I'm aiming to defeat Dracula, or I'm aiming to thoroughly explore every inch of the castle to uncover every one of its secrets and get that elusive 220.6% map completion. Really, all I'm deciding is how much time I'll be spending in the castle in this particular run. There is a story to this game, but it only interrupts your traversal occasionally. The game opens with a reenactment of the closing segment of Dracula X. You play as Richter Belmont as he takes on and defeats Dracula. Upon defeat, the photograph of your encounter burns up, and the game proper starts, with you arriving at Dracula's abode in control of his half-human son, Alucard, last seen in Castlevania 3. Immediately, the concept of cycles of evil is presented. The villain was defeated, and we're already back to deal with him again. Dracula's castle appears but once a century. Why has it appeared again now? That is the question you begin with, and the answers may not be what you expect. Like the Metroid games before it, your path through the game, at least on your first go, is about figuring out what your boundaries are, where you cannot go. Maybe a door requires some sort of magic to open or a path is too high to reach. You hit a dead end and then consult your map, see where you haven't been and go exploring. I find this sort of game design to be enthralling to this day. There's nothing like a location that feels like a puzzle to unlock. You see an iron grate you cannot get past and begin to wonder what kind of ability will allow you to pass later on. Getting an upgrade and realising that this will be the one to let you access that previously locked off area is one of those feelings I find never gets old in games. Many people refer to these sorts of games today as Metroidvanias, and while I have adopted the term quite often, it does suggest that it was Castlevania and Metroid that pioneered the structure. Really, Metroid was 3 games deep by now, and Super Metroid had fully defined how these games feel to play. Symphony of the Night is more of an iteration of that, coupled with the steps towards being more exploration based earlier entries had made. Still, there weren't a whole lot of other games doing this sort of thing back then, so maybe the portmanteau is justified. Either way, it's a compelling structure for a game. Really, these exploration platformers are just more of an evolution of your classic level by level based games that dominated the 8 and 16-bit days. In those games you're often confined to one path, so having a whole location full of varied environs to discover and conquer felt almost like wish fulfillment. Before, the castle's walls would be separate from the libraries and the clock tower, but here you could see how they were linked and what places lie in between. As you pass through the castle, you'll come up against tougher enemy bosses that'll give you a little test of your skill, whilst blocking the new area you're looking to explore next. For the first half of the game, these are a mixture of new monsters, enemies repurposed from Dracula X, and even a clone of yourself. There's a second half to discuss where things change a little, but we'll get to that later. You'll cross paths with one Maria Renard, a character that first appeared as a child in Dracula X, but is now an adult trying to find out what happened to Richter, who disappeared a year earlier, believing the sudden reappearance of the castle has something to do with this. She's on the right path. She's not the only friendly face in the castle. Well, she kind of is. Your other 2 options are an old librarian who seems mostly interested in your coins, and a boatman who I'm only classing as friendly because he doesn't try to kill you. Everything else wants you dead though. For the vast majority of the game you'll be wandering through the halls on your own. There's a sense of solitude to your onward march as you slay countless undead. The castle is a conduit for evil though, and your only way through it is through them. This isn't easy early on. Not long after you arrive, Death himself will turn up and take your armour and weapons away. It won't take long to pick up a new sword and shield, but this can be a bit of a surprise if you've not played this sort of game before. Not many games take away power from you at such an early stage, but a trope of many Metroidvanias is this setup exactly. They let you experience taking out enemies in a way that's easy and safe, giving you a little idea of how the game will structure itself before resetting you to a base level. Before long, you'll be way more powerful than you were in those first few rooms though. Boss battles come pretty frequently, and while a few can present a challenge, especially the first battle against your doppelganger, the challenge of the bosses isn't too tricky to overcome. In fact, of all the Castlevanias, this is probably the least challenging overall. I think that's part of why I enjoy it so much. I've never felt like I hit a roadblock in the game. If a boss beat me up, I'd just hit a bunch of monsters until I leveled up a bit, and then come back and whoop on them. Or just play better. Bosses are quite often the sort you'll need to learn the pattern of, and then hit them at the right points, or trap them in the corner and cheese it. But what of the final boss? When you ascend the stairs to Dracula's Keep, well, fly over where they were in the back form because the castle maintenance is one heck of a task, and there before you is not the Dark Lord Dracula. Instead you're greeted by Richter Belmont, the hero of Dracula X Rondo of Blood, the guy we played as right at the start of this game and saw defeat Dracula. We saw it. He killed Dracula, and the image of his demise turned into a photograph and burned away like pieces of the past that have been forgotten, or maybe now destroyed. How could Richter be the lord of the castle? You see, this game is all about legacy. Familial legacy to be specific. Richter says so himself after defeating Dracula. What use does a Belmont have? Their family is predicated on being the ones that fight Dracula once a generation. They train for it their whole lives, and when the day arrives they pick up the whip and go do the thing they're meant to do. But what about after that? Would a Belmont really turn evil just to keep the fight going? Just to keep his legend alive? Spoilers, but no, there's more to it. We'll get there later, just to hold on for once in your lives. You know who else has a legacy? That Dracula. In fact, you're his legacy. Not you sat at home watching this, but the guy you control in the game. Alucard is Dracula's half-human son, and despite having that connection to an evil lord of the night, he was raised as a human by his mother, who is a pretty all-round good lady. Plus, Daddy was only home once a lifetime and didn't seem to be bothered to check in on his kid. Watch the first episode of the anime for more, or not. She got burned at the stake for being a consort of evil, but thanks to Alucard's upbringing, he didn't seek revenge on the humans. His heart wasn't twisted like his father's was. He forgave the humans as he knew they acted out of ignorance. Alucard spent a lot of his life either asleep or in exile to avoid the temptation to give in to his vampiric side. Good lad. But here he is answering the call to put a stop to his father's legacy. You know, the castle and evil and all that. And being faced with most recent descendants of the legacy that was tasked with fighting Dracula. It's all legacies inside of legacies, and the answer is to tear it all down, I guess. Thankfully, whoever commands the castle is a load-bearing boss, and defeating them brings the whole thing down. 2 birds with 1 stone, baby. But could it really be that Richter has turned evil? Are his dark desires and doubts of his place in the world being manipulated? Well, I think before we get there I should tell you a tale of my gaming past. I brought my copy of Symphony of the Night from GameStation in Woking back in the mid-90s, not long after release, for around £12. It was a 2D game in a 3D era and they'd often end up being reduced to clear. £12 was a bargain even at the time, seeing as it came with an art book and a soundtrack CD of music from previous Castlevania games. Anyway, I played this game for a while, explored the castle a fair amount, got to Dracula's Keep and discovered that ownership of the castle has indeed appeared to have changed hands as we discussed. And that's when I beat the snot out of Richter, saved the day, and all was well. At the time I considered the game done. It was still early days for the internet and I was rarely on forums and the like at the time. I wasn't looking up guides for games I had already beaten with my precious charged by the minute time I had online. Sometime later, probably 6 months to a year, I felt like revisiting the game to 100% it. It's nice to clean up after all. And so I did. I wandered the castle, turning all the dark blue parts of the map to a lighter shade, finding new areas and items. The castle was pretty big. 2 items stood out though. A pair of rings inscribed with the words Ware Clock and In Tower. What could this mean? Obviously, I never figured this out. The end. Thanks for watching everybody, like and subscribe. I kid. I put the rings on and proceeded to the clock tower at the near centre of the map, a place I had passed through many times. In this room 3 paths had often opened up in the roof at various points in the adventure, but this time something different happened. The clock hands pointed down and the floor opened, leading to a strange occult tomb. In there, Maria catches up to me and discusses Richter, mentioning that she believes he must be under someone's control. She hands me some glasses that are said to reveal illusions. Pretty clear what I had to do now. That's right, wander around the castle aimlessly expecting the hidden wall to open. Okay, I did do that, but not for long. Eventually I figured out it's worth giving Richter another beating, and so I headed to Dracula's throne room, and shock horror, a truth was revealed. An illusion, if you will. A green ball floating around the room during the boss fight. I smacked the ball about a bit and revealed Alucard's true enemy. Not Dracula, but the evil wizard Shaft. He warns that he is not defeated just yet, and that the resurrection of Dracula is close at hand, before vanishing. A cutscene cinematic plays showing the clouds above the castle swirling, and through them comes another castle. Well, the same castle but upside down. You can now travel to this second inverted castle where the adventure continues. Honestly, I had no idea at the time that this was a thing. Sure, it was the same castle, but you're walking on ceilings now. But it was more game, and that was a big deal. In this inverted castle you had new enemies, bosses and items. As you travel around you'll fight a mixture of classic Castlevania bosses such as Frankenstein's monster and the mummy, collecting pieces of Dracula's body as you go. Navigating the inverted castle is fairly easy, seeing as by this point you'll be fully skilled up. although there's a few secrets still to find. This inverted castle is a lot like a victory lap. It's your chance to just rip through enemies in a familiar place and make your way to the true final battle with Shaft and Dracula. Spoilers, but you'll fight Dracula at the end. It's a Castlevania game, what else did you expect? It doesn't take as long to beat this version of the castle as the first, but it is still a fun journey. Sure, you could say it's cheap padding to lengthen a somewhat short game, but it was already the biggest Castlevania game ever at the time, so what more do you want? Finishing the inverted castle was something I pretty much did over the course of a few nights. When I was done, I had got the better ending. I went straight back in to see what other secrets the game had. Turns out it's not many, just a lot of getting into every space on the map. Completion percentage is based on how much of the map is uncovered, and it's possible to break a few areas to get that extra 20.6% I mentioned. The mood of this game compelled me to keep going, all these unique areas to uncover with their own gothic vibes. It's not just marbled hallways and clock towers and sewers, there's networks of caverns, caves filled with fire and a whole coliseum. There's extra boss battles to take on that aren't required for story completion, but will be if you want to find everything. The whole experience is backed by some incredible music from Michiru Yamane, which almost never leans on the Castlevania staples of Vampire Killer and Bloody Tears. Almost every track is new just for this game, and it lends a whole new feel to the series if you've come from the earlier 8 and 16-bit entries. One discovery I remember making that has now become a habit for me every playthrough is finding the ultra rare weapon Chrysogrim. It's a sword that only spawns from one enemy in one area of the game, and every time I play, whether I intend to use the sword or not, I make sure I collect it. The easiest way is to keep entering this inverted library hallway, killing the pose that spawn here over and over until the Chrysogrim drops. It can take a while. The power of this sword is obscene, it just slices through everything in your path, even bosses, even the end of game boss. It's almost like activating an easy mode, except the game is already not too challenging and you can't get it until you're well on your way to Dracula anyway. Still, it's a lot of fun just tearing through everything as you clean up the final nooks and crannies of the castle. To say I was satisfied with Symphony of the Night is an understatement. Before discovering the second half of the game, I had thought it was a fun enough adventure that wasn't quite up there with the Final Fantasy VII's, Suikoden's and Metal Gear Solids of the PS1 library. After finishing the second half, it became an all-timer, an unforgettable experience that must be played. Thankfully, these days, you have quite a few options for that. At the time, the game was a PS1 exclusive, with a Sega Saturn version releasing a year later. The Saturn port has an extra area you can play as Maria, and it also has an additional third hand to equip potions to, so you don't need to enter a menu to use them, a feature missing from other ports. It's generally considered the lesser version of the two due to some graphical and performance issues, but it's still Castlevania. It's also generally about half the price of the PS1 version these days, although still outrageously expensive. In 2007, the game received a port to the Xbox 360. Due to there being limits on the size of downloadable Xbox Live Arcade games at the time, the CG cutscenes have all been removed, although they were added to the Japanese release later. Also, the ending song was changed in a later patch. You can actually get a physical release of this in the US, which goes for a more reasonable price than the PS1 and Saturn versions. The PS1 original is available on PlayStation 3 as a PS1 classic. Hopefully this version will appear on PlayStations 4 and 5 now they offer PS1 games. Also in 2007, Dracula x Rondo of Blood was released on the PSP in the US. This 3D remake of the PC Engine game features the original game as well as Symphony of the Night. You have to find it hidden away in the game, but once you do, you can play it whenever you like. This version features a new take on Maria as a playable character, an entirely re-scripted and redubbed version of the game's dialogue. It's not as good, and this is a fact, don't start. The PSP version of Symphony of the Night, along with the port of Rondo of Blood from the same collection, were both released as the Castlevania Requiem collection on PS4 in 2018. This had a physical release, but it's limited run, and so is going to get a bit more expensive. Still, it's available to download on PS4 and PS5. As it seems to be using a PSP emulator to run, it's likely these ports will stay PlayStation exclusive. That said, the earlier mentioned Xbox 360 version is backwards compatible with Xbox One and Series consoles. It's good to have option. It's a shame physical copies can be expensive these days, but I'd recommend the PSP Dracula X collection as the cheapest way to get you a copy you can actually hold. Other than that, the PS4 release is very nicely done, and the Xbox 360 version is a solid pick and the cheapest of them all. It's that version that I've likely played the most over the years too. When it was released, I churned through the game multiple times, wrestling with that 360 D-pad the whole way. I got to the point where I could casually finish it in a few hours. I actually have a 5.5 hour long let's play of that version on the channel from many years back that I recorded in one afternoon. Ideally I'd say play the original, but even the way cheaper US and Japanese copies can go for £90 plus, and I wouldn't recommend trying to get the PAL copy no matter how nice it is. Just get the version on the PS3 store while it's still open. Recently uncovered was a prototype of a port for the Tiger Electronics Game.com. It actually looks kind of impressive for a device that was, how should we put this, not good in the slightest. If you really want to see what state that version is in, I suggest you watch Stop Skeletons from Fighting's video on this unreleased and unfinished port. Derek really went in depth in an attempt to see all the prototype had. It's quite a blessing really that the game has been made available time and time again over the years. I think about games such as Tombi, Rapid Reload and The Adventures of Little Ralph that are all highly praised 2D games from the PS1 era that have never had a second release in any form. Despite Konami being a shadow of their former selves these days, it's got to be said that their retro game releases have been pretty consistently good, and they've certainly made sure they're available. Mostly. Where's a Rocket Knight Adventures collection, eh? The legacy of Symphony of the Night is one that maybe took a few years to show itself. At the time it wasn't considered a huge hit, and Konami pivoted to attempting to take Castlevania into the third dimension. There was 2 N64 games that achieved this to a certain extent. Actually, the second is mostly a better version of the first. They're not great, but people do seem to have some nostalgia for them now. A pair of 3D Castlevanias were released in the PS2 era, which I think are pretty decent. Almost every 2D Castlevania since Symphony of the Night has been made in that original game's image. This started and was refined with the Game Boy Advance trilogy, which have been released on modern consoles and are well worth playing. There was also 3 games on the Nintendo DS too. These all share the same exploration-focused structure as Symphony of the Night, and some would say they even improve on it. To be fair, Aria of Sorrow on the Game Boy Advance is pretty incredible. You can further see the game's influence in the many Metroidvanias around today. Obviously a lot of this comes from Metroid too, but you only have to look at games like Chasm and Koji Igarashi's own spiritual sequel, Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night, to see how much Symphony of the Night specifically has created a demand for more games of its ilk. I certainly enjoy playing games of this type, even if they can get very familiar now. Whilst the Castlevania series is in a bit of a state of limbo these days, it has been 8 years since the last entry in the rebooted series and nearly 15 since the last in the original lineage. I'd like to think the series isn't dead yet. Hopefully one day we'll see a return of that classic Castlevania look and style, whether it's a linear adventure like the earlier games or something more exploration focused like the post-Symphony of the Night offerings. Personally, I feel it's time Konami handed the license over to developers who grew up on these games and give them a chance to show us what they've got. Not like Konami are doing anything with the series right now, well, other than pachinko machines and anime. I keep coming back to legacies. This game series was built from the legacy of horror novels turned to film. It references those old films I spent an age talking about at the start all the time. The game itself was an attempt to build on the already well-revered name of the original games for a new generation. Gameplay wise, it borrows from its gaming peers by working in the Metroid structure and RPG like levelling and item usage. The story is all about the legacies we leave to the next generation. These days it's pretty easy to find games that fit the Metroidvania genre, along with the game that has gained generational resonance with gamers and the collectors of games. It's been released on every generation of consoles since the Xbox 360, and I imagine it'll be released a few more times at the least. This game is the midpoint of a legacy we're still experiencing and enjoying today. Suffice to say, Castlevania Symphony of the Night is one of my all-time favourites, and I imagine it holds a similar status to some of you watching this. If you've never played it, I hope I've influenced you to give it a try. I do wonder if it's a game that has been played by the younger generations of gamers out there. If you're younger than this game and have played it, let me know. It can be very easy for us old gits making these videos to just assume that our history with a game series is a universal one. And with that, it's time to close out this episode of Mellow Gaming Recommends. It's been a long time coming, and I hope the episode has at least been worth your time. Thank you for watching, and feel free to tell me what your favourite Metroidvanias are in the comments, or even tell me why I shouldn't use that term. Sometimes I like to use exploration adventure games instead. Also, a big thanks to my Patreon backers who put up with so many delays from me. You guys are rad. Do feel free to check out the Patreon if you'd like to nudge me towards the next stretch goal, where you'll get to pick out indie games to play on the channel, and also another creator to back on Patreon. I'll catch you all next time when I decide which game of a select few I have in mind I'll be covering next. We may be staying on the PlayStation 1 for the next episode. Catch you all later, and thanks again for watching.